Well, good morning, everyone. On behalf of Mr. Abbey and the Planning Committee and the staff and leadership at the Baker Institute at Rice University, I'd like to welcome you to Day 3 of the International Space Medicine Summit. We'd particularly like to thank all of the panelists who've participated in the summit so far. Some of these sessions have been outstanding and very thought-provoking, and I think that will continue through the two panels that we have today. I'd also like to thank the sponsors who've helped make this possible, in addition to Rice and the Baker Institute, Bader, and Texas A&M universities. Thanks so much for your support of the summit. This is an unusual Day 3 because typically we go about half of the way with panels and then do breakout sessions. And those are usually very productive, but it's been difficult for those to be productive in this type of format where there's so many different computer type things that have to happen. So we've given the panels a little more time today. And hopefully that will allow interaction between the panelists and between the panelists and the moderators, but more importantly, those in the attendees who they can submit questions and comments to the panelists during these sessions. I'm really happy that Dr. Bonnie Dunbar and Dr. Carl Deutsch are leading this. They've been doing this for quite a while. I was looking at least Dr. Deutsch has been doing this to at least 2009 and probably further back than that. Dr. Bonnie Dunbar is originally from Washington. She attended Washington University where she got a bachelor's and master's in ceramic engineering. She used that skill to work with shuttle contractors working on the very important shuttle tile system. Then she went to NASA in 1978 and then became an employee, an astronaut in 1981 after being an employee for 3 years. In 1983, while an astronaut, she got her Ph.D. in biomedical engineering at the University of Houston. And while at NASA, she flew on 5 different shuttle missions. She also went to Russia and opened up our training program as one of the crew members for the Shuttle Mir program. Spent a lot of time there and used that skill on STS-71, where she flew on the first docking mission to the International Space Station, and did spend quite a bit of time on the Mir space station. After leaving NASA, she's done stints at the Museum of Flight in Seattle. Also went to the University of Houston, where she was a professor there and very involved in the STEM program. She went 90 miles up the road to Texas A&M, where she's a professor of aerospace engineering at Texas A&M and director of the Aerospace Human Systems Lab there in aerospace engineering. She's also a non-resident fellow in space policy at the James A. Baker Institute at Rice University. Carl got his Ph.D. in aerodynamics at Imperial College in London. He's done about everything you can do with the Canadian space program, including being the active director of the Canadian Space Agency. He was instrumental in development of the astronaut program there. He also was a chairman of the Canadian Space Plan Task Force. He was the founding president of International Space University. He chaired the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Space. He served as president of the International Astronautical Federation and has been chair of Athena Global. We have 2 outstanding moderators today, and I'm very much looking forward to your session, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jennings, for that introduction. And I'd like to start by thanking Mr. Abbey for initiating and continuing to arrange this excellent series of International Space Medicine Summits. We also thank him again for including a session on education and STEM advances. Bonnie Dunbar and I, as co-moderators of the panel, are delighted to participate again. We have an excellent panel to discuss this topic, and either Bonnie or I shall introduce each speaker prior to his or her first contribution. As has been the case each year since the annual International Space Medicine Summits were first established by Mr. Abbey and Bobby Alford some 15 years ago, we continue to be stimulated by the new things we learn at them and the progress that has been made year by year in the field of space medicine. Not surprisingly, some of the earliest points of discussion remain unresolved and require continuing and active development. Among them is that of achieving a concerted global effort in the area of education and outreach to support future space initiatives, and in particular, for long-duration flights to destinations far from Earth. Such an effort is diverse and spread across continents. Its ultimate success will be measured by how the various contributions add up and complement each other throughout society to provide the necessary support and workforce for these major adventures of humanity. In the past couple of years, there's been palpable public interest raised by the start of the commercial flights carrying paying passengers into suborbit and orbit. Of course, I'm referring to the flights of Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, and SpaceX. In our area of education and outreach, I'm pleased to note again, as I did last year, the important initiative by Blue Origin Club for the Future to fund with $1 million each 19 non-profit organizations whose goal is to further outreach and education for space. Included among the many important recipient organizations are the international organizations such as the International Astronautical Federation and the Space Generation Advisory Council, which is really home to many of the next generation of space enthusiasts and workers. The results are already being felt. We continue to hope that this initiative by the Club for the Future will become an ever more important catalyst for other commercial enterprises to actively promote human spaceflight as part of societal evolution. Human exploration of the moon and beyond continues to raise public interest in space activity in most spacefaring nations, and even more so in those that have not yet become spacefaring nations. As well, the public is once again engaged in seeking a better understanding of the universe, stimulated by the remarkable images from the James Webb Space Telescope. However, regarding the next generation of young people that would start new space activities, I must note the concern of many of them now making career direction choices about climate change, the protection of Earth's environment, new conflicts, and major shifts in the perceptions of democracy and alliances of the past. We need to be able to demonstrate that human spaceflight remains compatible with and important in this changing world. We need space education and outreach to maintain space activity both as a priority for humankind and to inspire and lead to the necessary workforce development. As we indicated last year, over the years, space education panels have assessed the situation and made recommendations on how we could do better. Ideas have been presented as the outcome of the concluding discussion groups of each summit. Some of our recommendations have come to pass, but many continue to need a focused collaborative effort by government, industry, academia, not-for-profit organizations, international organizations such as the UN, UNESCO, and the International Astronautical Federation in order to make significant inroads. Where do we still have work to do? To inspire the young and the public to have an interest in and to engage in space activity, to develop and make widely available internationally accessible databases of outreach material, to develop best practices for outreach, including new communication techniques, to provide funding and opportunities for the next generation to access aerospace professionals and to gain hands-on experience, thereby enabling workforce development, and to strengthen the links to education systems, their curricula, and their research, and identify funding needs and sources. We should be particularly interested in hearing from panelists, perhaps in the discussion period of the panel, how pilot schemes can be converted to broad-based initiatives and actions in education and outreach as the world readies itself for long-duration missions on the moon and beyond. Each panelist will give introductory comments, and this will be followed by panel discussions of the various topics. Our first panelist today to speak is Chris Barber. Chris is the founder and director of the International Space School Education Trust, ISET. He has developed and provided space education programs since 1998. The program includes Mission Discovery, which enables young people to work with astronauts, NASA leaders and scientists to get their ideas for experiments carried out on the ISS. The programs are carried out both face-to-face and virtually. The program includes student programs at 5 different US space centers, Star City and ISRO in Bangalore. It includes the outdoor astronaut leadership experience. And finally, astronaut visits to schools, universities, communities in the UK, India, Norway, Singapore, Australia, China, Mongolia, and Ireland. Chris, you've got a really good start in outreach there. Please, let's have your comments.
Turn your mic on.
Right, I was just testing you for your lip reading ability. So, right, for those of you who are deficient in this, I'll keep the mic on. Yeah, well, it's great to be a panelist again. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm always grateful to Mr. Abbey for all of the help he's given us. And it's an appropriate day for us as we've just launched from, or had launched for us from Wallop's 7 student experiments that'll be carried out on the ISS, which range from biomedical through to physics-based experiments. So we're really pleased about that. The notes asked us to talk about things that might be new. And one of the great things that has been set up has been a partnership with UNESCO. Senior scientists from UNESCO visited our programs during the year. And the idea is that this partnership will enable us to take some of our programs throughout Africa. My only condition about going to Africa was that so long as we could come back in one piece without spending any period of time in incarceration, then we were happy to go anywhere at all in Africa. The notion is, of course, quite clearly with our programs, which are dealing with STEM, space, education, particularly girls' education. But the UNESCO, I understand, see the development of space and inculcating space education into young people as a major arm in fighting against poverty, hunger, developing new and modern industries, and enabling nations in Africa to work together. It's nice to see Linda here, and I thank Linda in front of everybody because she joined us on our virtual girls STEM and space competition across the world that had teams of girls from 22 different countries participated, and the judges of that, who included Barbara Morgan, that many of you will know, selected an experiment from a team of girls from a small town stroke village in rural Kenya. And I'm sure that they were influenced by the difficulty and the challenges that these girls met in terms of working together and getting a virtual application launched. And we're pretty sure that out of all the applicants, those having won it and won the prizes associated with it will have made a bigger difference to those girls in that school than to anyone else who actually submitted any applications. So I think on terms of new things, that's about all from me. And thank you very much for such a kind introduction.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for bringing us up to date. You continue to expand your programs, and I particularly like what you said about reinitiating the activities with UNESCO, because they've been a very important force in the past in encouraging space activity for all. Our next speaker is Dan Barstow. Dan supports the Association of Space Explorers. He was a senior education manager for the International Space Station U.S. National Lab. In this role, he supported large-scale use of ISS by students, teachers, and the public. Previously, he was director of TERC's Center for Earth and Space Science Education, the president of the Challenger Learning Center Network, and the principal investigator for Windows on Earth, with its breathtaking photos of Earth taken by the astronauts. Now retired, he continues his work with Earth photography from space as education mission specialist for the Association of Space Explorers and as founding director of Bach in Space, with its joyous music as you fly over Earth. Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Carl. I really appreciate the introduction. And thanks, Chris, for coming before me alphabetically. It gave a good beginning to this wonderful session here. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'd like to, there are kind of two hats that I wear or have worn. One with as the senior education manager for the International Space Station, in which I spearheaded work done by many, many wonderful partners and completed a study of the impact of these programs. In fact, it's been a real revolution in access and engagement to space for students. A while back, most of the experience of students was learning about what scientists do. Now, the students are doing their own experiments, designing, building, launching, and operating, and you've just seen Chris mention some of those. We found over the 20 years, just looking at the U.S. National Lab, over 2.6 million students engaged directly in some hands-on experiments, ranging from zero robotics, where they control robots in space to have to do particular things in zero gravity. EarthCam, in which they control cameras photographing Earth, selecting targets as they fly over them. Genes in Space, of relevance to this conference, has students do genetic research, including some very innovative work with telomeres that is providing actual innovations in that science research and not just sort of a smaller scale student project. We'll add ExoLab, a portable kit that we launch up to space, have the comparable kit on the ground for doing plant experiments and so on. I could go on, but it's significant impact and a real revolution in this educational access. We also found that 45% of the participants were minority. That is certainly reflective of some important initiatives in that realm. And that the average number of hours was 10 hours on average per student per project, and sometimes as high as 100 hours or more as they did extended work on building and launching the experiments. And some total of 800 student experiments have been launched, which actually compares quite well with the number of science and business experiments that have been launched. The excuse me, their program called Space Station Explorers is the umbrella for this consortium of some 30 organizations working together. So the second hat I wear is with the Association of Space Explorers. Later on, you'll hear from Andy Turnage, who is the executive director, who will say a little bit more about ASE, but this is the Professional Association of Flown Astronauts. I wish I qualified to be a member, but instead I have to be a volunteer, education mission specialist. We have several important educational initiatives. One of them, the Windows on Earth project, now probably 15 years in existence, supports astronauts and the photography they do, with some 4 million images now available to the public. NASA has its own outreach, but we've got this website, windowsonearth.org, that we welcome and invite you to explore. We're using those creatively to help the astronauts in their own outreach with videos and photos to help them share their enthusiasm and engagement with Earth. But we also have a few interesting spin-off projects. One that is proposals submitted to cases for funding. We haven't yet gotten that confirmed, but we're hopeful. It's a project called Celebrating Diversity from Space, in which astronauts will share their own experiences of diversity among the astronauts and how that connected richness and diversity enables them to be more innovative in their work in space. Their second level is observing Earth and all the diversity around Earth and how all the interconnections are so crucial to Gaia, to our one planet. And the third is in the local communities of the students who participate through Boys and Girls Clubs and other events. We hope that will be funded. We have a number of stellar astronauts who would share their experiences as part of that. And finally, on more of a fun note, we found that if we just showed the videos or had a scientist explain it, might be dry. But if we added music, excuse me, we could really make it more engaging. So what the heck, as an experiment, we tried focusing on Johann Sebastian Bach. I mean, you may or may not be a fan of classical music. You can pick any music. But we found by connecting these musical pieces with the flyovers, that's actually getting quite a large audience. So after this session, if you want some fun, go to Bach in Space, excuse me, bachinspace.org, and you can check out some of those videos.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. You really are going deep into the outreach with the young and with novel ideas as well. So that's great. That's really exactly what we're looking for. I will now call upon Bonnie to introduce the remaining speakers. Bonnie?
Well, thank you very much, Carl. It's my pleasure to introduce a colleague that I've known for quite some time, Alex Blackwood from Scotland. He's the CEO of the International Educational Business Partnership Network, IPM. He's a graduate engineer from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland, a former teacher of mathematics and physics. He has, over his career, formed and led 3 educational business partnerships. Not only is he the founding member of IPM, but also of the Scottish Space School and the Scottish Space School Foundation, USA. In his work, he's responsible for what they call enterprise education programs and STEM programs linked alongside other international conferences. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Bonnie, and good afternoon and morning to everybody. Yes, first of all, I'd like to give some background. Originally, many years ago, we started the International Education Business Partnership Network. Now, that is really a network of programs and projects and government agencies across the world who had one thing in common, and they were doing projects and programs that linked enterprise and education and the business community. And through that partnership, we got to be involved with NASA, 22 years ago. And we started the Scottish Space School Foundation and the Scottish Space School Foundation. And we started lots of projects, both in terms of bringing people to Houston, Texas, bringing young people and teachers to Houston, Texas, and bringing NASA astronauts, engineers, and scientists to Scotland and traveling around Scotland to talk to young people. I then moved on and worked directly within a national partnership network, and that allowed me to involve other countries. And primarily, we got involved with countries as far away as Canada, to South Africa, Australia. And what we did was, and what we're still doing to this day, is to look at the projects around STEM that the people are doing in these countries and see how we can enhance those programs by the international interaction with the international space community. And so we've run lots of conferences with engineers and astronauts, lead speakers. Our conferences would range from Canada to South Africa to Norway. And the most recent one, just pre-COVID, was in Houston, Texas, at the Johnson Space Center, or Space Center Houston. So we're involved a great deal internationally now. We're still involved with school groups from Scotland, and we had a school group from Scotland at NASA just a few years prior to COVID. But we're doing work with Norway just now. This is one of the things I'd like to say is that one of the things that the COVID struck with us is that our raison d'etre really is around bringing people together, particularly young people, particularly in the case of Norway, young women, into getting that experience of those who work in the space community and with NASA and other space groups. So COVID did hit us a bit. And so we were doing a lot virtually, but most of that was keeping contacts with the people who help us. And it's just recently that we've got back in the swing of things. So we had a group of, as you know, Bonnie, we had a group of Norwegian young women who, but the thing I'd like to say about that program is that the program itself is much broader than what we interact with, because the program is a national program in Norway, and it's to encourage girls into engineering. What we provide is an opportunity for the successful young women across Norway to come to Houston and find out what's happening, be given talks by people like yourself, Bonnie, and others. And then these young women go back to Norway and they do a tour of the whole country to talk to young girls about their experiences with their national program, but also about their experience while they were in Houston, Texas. So we're doing that, and planning to do that with more of our international community. And we've worked, in fact, with a great deal of people, particularly in the United Kingdom and in South Africa and in Australia and Canada. But as I said earlier on, personal contact has been affected, but we are getting back there. And we have run an international conference in countries across the world starting in 1990, I can't believe it, all the way up to their conference in Houston, which was in 2018. And so we build up this international network. We use our contacts in Houston and some of our experiences in Houston and elsewhere, and that gives us that input to outreach that these people value. And we are beginning to build our programs up again. We expect to be back in February with teachers, and we'll certainly be back in April with more Norwegian young women. Okay.
Thank you very much, Alex. Really great program. We appreciate you bringing that to the U.S. as well, and for your long commitment to the Scottish Space School. I'd like to introduce now Dr. Ludmila Borovkova from Russia. She's the Deputy Director of the Institute of Biomedical Problems, or IBMP, as we know it. And I've had the opportunity to work there or to visit there as well as a training crew member. She's also a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences and head of the cell physiology lab. Her MD and her PhD were in topics related to biochemistry and space biomedicine, and she's been the principal investigator of many programs and projects supported by the Russian Academy and has had many experiments on board the International Space Station. She is coordinator and chairman of the International Summer School, Space Biology and Medicine, and has a long list of honors, including being an academician of the International Academy of Astronautics, a correspondent member of the Russian Academy of Sciences and Physiology. She received the Gagarin Medal in 2013, and in 2021 received the Roscosmos Award for International Cooperation. I'm sorry, that was 2014, and she received the award of the Ministry of Science and Education for Excellence in Science and Education in 2021. So with that, please take the floor, Dr. Borovkova.
Thank you, Bonnie, for nice introduction. And I would like to thank Mr. Abbey and Rice University for organizing this summit. I'm glad to see all my colleagues at this moment. In our field, we applied 3 levels of interaction with young generation. Is middle and senior school peoples, undergraduate student and PhD student. The first level education is mostly presented as play and go activities, including presentation and contests. High level students, teenagers involved in short scientific projects, including ground-based experiments, and they visit our institution and communicate with scientists from different labs. Next level is undergraduate student. IBMP has a long-term agreement with 4 leading universities: Moscow State University, Moscow Medical University, Moscow Aviation University, and Bauman Technical University. In frame of this collaboration, undergraduate students fulfill the personal scientific project. It's maybe bachelor degree project or master degree project, and during this work, students involved in all scientific activity, including space flight experiment and ground-based experiment. I would like to say some words with special space faculty. This faculty organized in Moscow State University some years ago, and we have also special agreement with Moscow Space University and our institute responsible for master program. We have 10 students per year who participate in our experiment. They use all university infrastructure for education and all infrastructure our institute for experimental work. Also, we have special training courses for PhD students in physiology and space biomedicine. During 4 years, the young people, young scientists, take part in a space flight project on board of ISS now, and ground-based experiment like isolation, immersion, special experiment using crate, or special experiment like biome. And then it's these young scientists have some postdoc position in our institute and involved in scientific activity in full program. And I would like to say some words about special scientific activity or space activity in Moscow. At the beginning of November, each year at the beginning of November, we have in Moscow special day named Day of Sciences. It means that during 3 days, Day of Sciences, but during 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, Moscow University and leading scientific center are open for all people who are interested in science. And our Institute of Biomedical Problems, during this day is the point of space biology and medicine. So we try to involve you young generation in our experiment, in our investigation, and we try to show the real space experiment, real space activity, real international cooperation on board of ISS now during some excursion or some contacts with the people who are interested in science. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Really interesting comments, and I think it also highlights the need to not only look at K through 12, but undergraduate and graduate education through the whole pipeline as we create the scientists of the future as well. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Linda Godwin, Dr. Godwin. She's the Emeritus Professor of the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri. She taught physics and astronomy classes for 8 years and worked with students in undergraduate research projects in astrophysics, and she serves as an adjunct capacity. She received her BS in mathematics and physics from Southeast Missouri State University and an MS and Ph.D. in physics from the University of Missouri. She joined NASA in 1980 in mission control and payload operations, where she was a payload flight controller and officer, and selected as an astronaut in 1985. She flew 4 flights on the space shuttle, logging over 915 hours or 38 days in space. And while with NASA, she also had a number of management assignments. She was deputy chief of the astronaut office. She was acting deputy director of flight crew operations. And she was the flight crew representative during the development of future exploration programs. She has several awards, including the NASA Distinguished Service Medal and the Exceptional Service Medal. And in 1992 and 1996, she received the American Astronautical Society Flight Achievement Award. So Linda, it's all yours.
Remembered that unmute just in time. Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks for that nice introduction. And it's good to see all the faces here today. And I thank again, Mr. Abbey, for the opportunity to be on this panel, and for Bonnie and Carl for moderating. And I did get to see some of these faces in person over the last year, like Mike and Andy and Richard, but I hope we get to do this face to face at some point in the future. I'm always happy to share my thoughts on education. And that's always, been, as all of the people on this panel and those listening know, such a prime focus of NASA, to bring along the educational component. I decided to make some comments more at an overview level, what I've seen, and touch on some of the things that we've talked about on this panel in the past. And so we all know education is about, we have to inspire the younger people and motivate them and educate them on possible, careers out there and what's in the STEM field. And space has always been such a grand way to provide a lot of that motivation. But I see, the problems I continue to see are the math support is the weak link, the students all the way up to higher ed and what they think they'd like to do, but what they feel they can do. And we have to worry about retention and all of that. So we have to inspire and we have to keep them in the program. and we have to probably start younger. But having said that, I wanted to make some comments starting from the highest of higher ed and work down a little bit. So what I see in my department is sort of a post-COVID resurgence of trying to get back on track. And I'm sure that's not uncommon in most of the areas around the country right now. And I'm particularly proud of our Grad Student Association. It has some really strong leadership this year, and they are promoting so many student-faculty interactions and social. They're worried about their own mental health and providing help for that. They're just really stepping out on a lot of local education outreach. And while I think what all of us do at NASA is important, it's really good when these younger students see people a little closer to their age, so coming out and interacting with them. And they do a lot on mentorship. So I'm proud of what our students can do, and interested in supporting them if it's possible to do that. When we work down to our undergraduate students, what I see is, of course, they come across, we get a lot of out-of-state students, but there's a lot of in-state, and that's a lot of diverse areas in Missouri, like in a lot of states that we represent and countries internationally. So how to give them equal opportunities in STEM is a bit of a challenge because they don't come with the same opportunities in middle school and high school. I know one thing that we have here is some really interesting field trips in science. It's not all physical sciences, but geology and biology and sometimes week-long trips to places like the Tetons. And I'm sure lots of high schools have that, but they sure don't have that in every part of the state. So when we see our students entering college, if they come from a school system like that and there's opportunities for engineering classes and higher level math and physical sciences in their high school, they do a lot better, when they hit our university. If they come without that, it's really hard to work their way in and be competitive because so many of these programs in engineering and physical sciences are mapped out from the first semester. So I think a real goal is how to bring students in on that equal footing. It's not entirely solvable, but what can we do to help? And eventually I get kind of backed up in my mind to middle school where it's so critical to inspire. But there is that math barrier to overcome because they have people around them that don't think it's important, and maybe they don't even see how they'll use math in their life. And that is where I think a lot of the STEM inspiration from NASA plays a role by saying, let us show you what's possible out there. We're coming into these great times with what we're doing in space. And in general, there's so much available in STEM, and there are great opportunities for you. And what I think has always been an incredible opportunity as well is to participate in things that are international. So if they're inspired by the fact that they could work in fields that they interact with people from around the world, I think that's even more inspiration for them. And there's such a migration component here too, because we still get a lot of students coming along that are first generation college. So it's harder for them to sometimes know what's out there and how to take advantage of the resources and end up in some of these fields. So while I do think there's a lot to be done in providing better education, and maybe there's an online component for that and getting over some of the math barriers, that there just isn't a lot of that in some parts of the state, inspiration is certainly the first step because you have to want to do it first, to put in the time. So I look at it as we are entering this era that has such tremendous inspirational possibilities now that we're getting so close to Artemis 1 and we're going back to the moon and we have all the commercial space. So a lot of these components have come up before in our discussions on this panel, and it's hard to wrap our arms around it and move forward. But I know there's a lot of education out there right now that NASA has a lot. I was recently looking again at the stem.nasa.gov and just thinking about how do we make all the schools aware of it. So I think that's one of the challenges out there. And I'm kind of inspired to try to do more myself because I know that even us old astronauts seem to be interesting to these students when we go talk to them and we show them our pictures and we're saying, here's what you can do in space. You have to maybe decide you like this in middle school. Here are my friends from around the world, and you can have relationships like that too. So I think we bring a lot to inspire people and try to get them into these fields, these STEM fields. I mentioned this, I believe, last year too, but I'll mention the astrofemina.org group, which has a lot of women in it. I think I'm the only one, I think, on the panel here today that's a part of that, although I'm not sure actually. But we have partners and sponsors and donors that are really trying to establish, opportunities for young women, and a lot of it middle school age in STEM, just to hear more from people who have worked in these fields. And we're interested in more diversity probably coming into that group. And while a lot of them have been women in STEM fields that touch NASA and aerospace, they're looking to expand that just to reach as many young people as we can. So I just kind of want to put a plug in for that. I'd be happy to connect anyone with that. Sandy Magnus really leads it up. Has done a great job. Jan Davis is very involved. So I think we all probably know of different organizations that we can be a part of to encourage these young students. So I guess my intent in my remarks this morning was just to kind of talk about in my community the things that I know are going on, but to really emphasize that I think middle school is a good place for us to target NASA's resources. And those resources are there, but somehow the connection is not always made in all parts, of our countries and our states. But there's so much potential right now. I think this is a great time, to really emphasize the STEM education.
Thank you, Linda. Really appreciate your remarks. And what you see from a university perspective, I also see. I think one of the largest underserved communities in our state are the rural areas. And having come from a farm, I can attest to that. So with that, I'd like to introduce Francesco Fusca. He's a senior propulsion engineer with the Boeing Company and the executive director of the Foundation for International Space Education. The FISE mission is to promote STEM studies and international collaborations by providing space-based academic instruction and a collaborative environment to international pre-collegiate students while offering an introduction to the aerospace industry. And I know I had the opportunity to interact with one of your groups of students who came down to the University of Houston Clear Lake, I believe it was. And that was a fun experience. So now it's all over to you, Francesco.
Yeah, thank you, Bonnie. And so a little update on the foundation whereabouts. Well, the major things this year was that we went back in person. So after 2 years, 2020 and 2021, that we basically re-tailored the program to be virtual as a global space school. It was quite successful, and we're actually working now on changing it a little bit to try to target maybe a single country or few countries in the same time zone or similar time zone. So we could actually reach out. Probably the first one that we're going to roll it out will be in Ethiopia, where we had an overwhelming number of applications 2 years ago. So virtual is great. It allows you to reach more students, and it's actually easier on us. But the in-person brought back all the enthusiasm of the students, and it was very good for me to notice that because one of my fears is this social awkwardness, right, that is developing in a youngster that are behind a computer. They feel different in a way, and then when you actually meet somebody in person, they don't know really how to behave. So see them together and appreciate being together was definitely for me very important. We did face, of course, a lot of challenges this year. The program kind of sails smooth with a lot of inertia. And when you stop that mechanism for 2 years, it was kind of hard to start it again. One of the problems was, of course, we based on host families, and many host families were not comfortable to host students from other country yet. So we had to downsize a little bit for 2022. In fact, I think we only got 39 students instead of our 50, 55, which we typically bring to Houston every year. And even with that, we had to run some challenging with mentors and teachers. But it worked out. Of course, COVID impacted us. One thing, like we have, for example, turned down a student was the only one non-vaccinated. We did not have a specific requirement in the program, but when we had to place the student, no host family again felt comfortable to host a non-vaccinated student. So unfortunately, we had to turn her down, which was quite heartbroken from us, and I'm pretty sure for the student itself. But then, of course, with all those students, all the host families returning to work, COVID hit us during the school. And it was quite a challenge also to isolate per the CDC rule, let them continue virtual while in a host family home, return with the mask, and ask a teenager to wear a mask when they just want to be with each other is not easy. Try to get social distancing is not easy. But we managed to, I think, about 25% of the student ended up getting it. Fortunately, none of them were any difficult case. I mean, it was pretty much mild and resolved in a couple of days. We did have some host families that also got it. We were lucky that not both husband and wife got it at the same time. They would have made hosting a really challenge. But anyway, so COVID is still making an impact. We're trying to overcome that, and hopefully we're more and more going back to normal. So we're starting to organize now 2023. And hopefully we won't have those challenging for next year. But like Dan was saying, we noticed too a peak interest for space. Interest for space never went away in the youngster, but now it's even more. Definitely what is helping is that exciting activities that is going around. There's launches continuously now. And also the new company that actually they joined the space program have a better way to communicate with youngster, I think. And that helps. We have in particular a lot of interest coming from South America. We have several countries that is trying to engage us to do other things besides the United Space School. And so we are actually in a process of organizing events and conferences and things like that with a specific country for next year, early next year. So a lot of activities, and we're trying to keep up with it. I guess let others speak and talk. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Really interested in seeing the program get back on its feet. It's now my pleasure to introduce Michael Lembeck. He's the Clinical Associate Professor in Aerospace Engineering in the Department of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He provides lessons learned to his students based on his 40 years of experience in commercial space, government contracting, and NASA. He's also the director of the Laboratory for Advanced Space Systems at Illinois. He provides students with opportunities to design, build, and fly experimental CubeSat satellites. And he's very involved in committees with the AIAA. So, Mike, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bonnie. And of course, I'd like to thank Mr. Abbey for providing such an excellent forum for learning and exchange of ideas, and to Bonnie and Carl for moderating this session. This past summer, we moved our Laboratory for Advanced Space System into a new modern facility, and it was my pleasure to host Linda and the Nagel family for the Mission Operations Center that's named in Steve's honor, and pass along his legacy to future generations. Within our lab, we've also had a number of new projects started up this past year. Nanoracks commercial airlock up on the space station has a number of external ports that they've now made available for commercial operations, and they wanted to check them out. And a year ago, this time last year, they asked us if we had anything we could fly. And if you had told me at that time that we were going to build a student-run project that included a collaboration between JPL, University of Waterloo, University of Singapore, and two departments within our university, I would have thought that would have been a challenge. But we're actually about 2 weeks away now from delivering that payload, which will do some quantum entanglement and annealing experiments as an attached payload on the space station. We're also doing work for the Fermilab up in the Chicago area on a dark matter detection satellite, and working with Virginia Tech on a satellite that looks at the upper atmosphere for gravity waves. So we have a number of flight projects in-house that the students are working on that were never available when many of us went through school so many years ago. Also, about 3 years ago at the summit, I talked with Jim Voss about the material that he had composed for his introductory course in human spaceflight at Boulder. And that course now is prospering here at Illinois as well. It's become one of the most popular electives we have in aerospace engineering. I'm going to forever be indebted to Jim for his generosity and the benefits that our students are now receiving from being exposed to that material. As an engineer turned educator, I've also had to learn a few things in the last 3 years since I returned to campus. When I started teaching, I wanted to provide sort of a complete data dump of my experience to my classes. I quickly found out it's really impossible to do that you just can't transmit 40 years of experience in 4 months. So I've learned that students have to accumulate knowledge through their own journeys, and I found that I can best help them by serving more as a guardrail than an oracle. So what does that really mean? Our next generation of students that are coming through the system now don't have pension funds or 401ks to worry about. That really gives them a freedom to innovate and to take risks unimpeded by the inertia of the experience that we have and the retirement plans that we're trying to make. Like the Apollo generation in their youth, we need to give them breathing room to come up with their own concepts and approaches. We can still challenge them on the implications of their decisions, but we need to serve as the guardrails to keep them on the track, but not impede them as they go through their own journeys. We can also provide students access to our accumulated knowledge through providing tools that we leave behind for their use. But I tell my students that computers are inherently evil and should not be trusted without some sort of verification. I think Bill Shepard had a profound observation last week when he was talking about AI applications and their need to explain themselves before we can learn to trust them. Similarly, I think clinical educators like myself can be most effective when providing more insight for our students and perhaps a little less oversight into how to evaluate problems. Finally, to put a bow on this, I think the discussions last week on what it means to support future human operations at a distance led me to think that maybe we should perhaps reconsider human crews as being students on their own missions of exploration. Separating crews from their operators by 40-minute time delays is in many ways similar to separating children from their parents by 40 miles away at college, or students from their educators by 40 years of experience. We need to provide insight, sufficient autonomy, and to accept some level of risk for them to successfully operate on their own away from home. So those are some thoughts I've had gathering here over the last 3 years as I've become a better teacher, mostly learning from my students. And with that, Bonnie, I'll yield back to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your insights and enjoyed working with you when you were back down here in Houston as well. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Dr. Stephen Robinson, who's a tenured professor at UC Davis in the Mechanical Aerospace Engineering Department. He's also the director of the UC Davis Center for Spaceflight Research and the UC Davis Human Robotic Vehicle Integration and Performance Lab. Before joining UC Davis in 2012, Steve spent 37 years at NASA, where he worked as an engineer, a research scientist, and astronaut. He flew on 4 space shuttle missions, including 3 spacewalks. He's a UC Davis alumnus in mechanical aeronautical engineering, received a double BS in 1978, and received his MS and Ph.D. degrees from Stanford University in mechanical astroengineering. We currently have a couple of collaborations together in research with human kind of robotic interactions. And so I'm very much excited to see what Steve has to say. So go ahead.
Thank you, Bonnie. It's good to see everybody. And thanks especially to Carl and Bonnie for hosting us, and especially Mr. Abbey for being the glue of this community for so many years, our guide and our glue and so many other things. As Bonnie mentioned, Bonnie's research lab, and Bonnie does many things, but she also does leads PhD level research at a very important university at Texas A&M. And at UC Davis, we do some work that is collaborative in some degrees, and certainly I think supportive. I've been an educator now for 10 years, and it's hard to believe. And just like Mike said, it's a learning process. I'm still trying to figure it out. The students are teaching me, but maybe I'm a slow learner. But there certainly is a growing, maybe an exploding sense of excitement about spaceflight engineering and bioastronautics due to both the commercial companies' success, large and small, and NASA's plans for lunar exploration, the research being done on ISS right now, and of course, the dreams of Mars in the future. So I think all of us are probably seeing student enrollment and and desire to enter astronautical engineering is really growing. So how do we serve that? Here at UC Davis, we have, as Bonnie mentioned, created the Center for Spaceflight Research at the chancellor's level. So it's not just engineering, but it brings in also physiology. We have a big medical school, psychology, human performance, neuroscience, neuroplasticity, and all of the different, in our case, 8 different departments of engineering. And Center for Spaceflight Research is dedicated to experimental, theoretical, and computational research in a number of different topics, including space habitats that are enabled by semi-autonomous robotics. At 10:30 Central Time, we'll have a panel. I'm going to do a little ad for the panel, but we'll host a panel on automation or autonomy with humans in spaceflight. Very complex and fascinating topic. So if you can come to that, it'd be great. Let's see, what else are we doing? Center for Spaceflight Research, we're certainly concentrated on human systems integration with space. And this is interesting because, traditionally, engineers aren't taught too much about humans. But if humans are going to interact with spacecraft in any way, from the ground, inside, humans are going to design it, fix it, decide what it's going to do, respond to any kind of anomalies or faults. Engineers really have to know something about how humans work and how human capability can be augmented also with products of engineering. So human systems integration in space is really a focus for us, and that includes life support system design and modeling, thinking about the engineering aspects of emergency medical care for astronauts in space and emergency deorbit from low Earth orbit. We've been working on a series of inspection satellites for spacecraft safety and working on EVA informatics systems and exoskeletons, a range of undergrad and graduate students involved in this, with a pretty large population of master's degrees and PhDs. We're constantly challenged by trying to improve our statistics in diversity and making some progress there. It's a constant effort. In addition to the center here, we're also leading something NASA has sponsored, a Space Technology Research Institute sponsored out of NASA headquarters called the Habitats Optimized for Missions of Exploration. This is a large virtual research institute involving 7 different universities around the country. So it's Howard, Georgia Tech, Carnegie Mellon, CU Boulder, USC, Texas A&M, and UC Davis. It's about 75 different researchers. It's a 5-year program. We're just starting year 4. And the topic of the Space Technology Research Institute is smart habitats. In other words, integrating autonomous subsystems with periodic human involvement in the spacecraft, or not involvement, but crewed. So it won't be crewed all the time. This deep space habitat, we imagine, kind of like Gateway, will have people on it maybe 15% of its life only, but it always has to be capable of supporting life. It's a different sort of spacecraft. It requires autonomous systems to some degree, and that brings up a whole host of challenges, especially in working with humans on board. We are involved in parabolic flight testing of a number of different technologies. We've currently funded by NASA to test 2 different kinds of experiments. One is a countermeasure for space adaptation sickness. Another one is a very novel way of attitude control for small satellites. We're funded for 6 flights each, and flights 5 and 6 will start next week, actually, down in Fort Lauderdale. One of the things we do at UC Davis, since we have a pretty large effort in aerospace engineering, and we actually have an airport on campus as well, is we have a motion-based flight simulator to do research in human performance and also application of control theory but mostly we use it as an educational tool to give students who are studying space and aviation a chance to actually imagine, kind of experience what it's like to actually be in control of a flying machine. We're collaborating with NASA JSC on a series of CubeSats to support our inspection satellite effort. First launch is early next year, actually. Our integration is next month. And we have had for years a pretty strong outreach program. This is a student-led outreach program to local underserved and underrepresented fifth graders is where we're targeting. It's called STEM Outreach and Academic Reinforcement, or SOAR. And this has been very successful in really for both sides. The fifth graders certainly get a lot out of meeting with the college students. And, we don't sell aerospace. We don't encourage engineering. In fact, too much. We try not to do too much of that. What we try to do is say, without saying, here are some college students who are achieving their dreams. Maybe you could do that too. It's kind of our unspoken message. Well, we're all in we hope, the post-COVID shutdown effects. I won't say post-COVID because I don't think we're there, but we're certainly post the big shutdown of in-person education, so we're all back. And I don't know about you. I'd like to hear what you say, but I see a less developed ability in the students to do teaming. And this is a great concern because teams are how engineering is done, right? And so part of what we all try to teach in college is for students of engineering in engineering to be able to work together as in parts of teams. And I think they've really lost some of that through spending 2.5 years in the bedroom of their parents' house. That has also led to an interesting, I'm trying to put my finger on what this is, but I think it's a delay in social maturity. Their technical skills seem to have done okay. They've taken their tests, they've done their homework and done their studying, and so they're technically about where they are. But socially, social maturity, they seem to be behind significantly. But I'd love to hear your points of view on that. And I notice in the audience we've got Barbara Morgan, we've got Ana Diaz, and other educators. So we'd love to hear your points of view too. So I'll stop talking for now. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. I really appreciate your remarks. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Andy Turnage. He's the Executive Director of the Association of Space Explorers. He's a graduate of the University of California, San Diego, and George Washington University. And most of his career, he has been the Executive Director of the Association of Space Explorers. That's the world's only professional and educational association for flown astronauts and cosmonauts. Started back in the 1980s by a small group of international flyers, and now it encompasses everybody that's flown in space who wishes to be a member. So Andy, with that, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks for the nice introduction. Thanks to Mr. Abbey and the Baker Institute for organizing this interesting panel. It's very interesting every year. I wish I could have participated last year, but was unable to. Dan Barstow has already talked a little bit about some of our STEM efforts. So I just wanted to give you an overview on some of the other things that we're doing as an organization. So as Bonnie mentioned, we have nearly 400 living orbital space flyers in 38 different countries. That started out with a handful, 26 flyers from 13 countries. So space is growing, and we've been able to maintain a strong presence in this ever-expanding space ecosystem, both on the government side and the nascent private side of astronautics. So exciting times for everybody, and lots of new pathways for folks to get into space and human space flight. You don't have to just go through one of the space agencies anymore. There's plenty of companies out there that'll be happy to take on qualified workers to meet their needs as we move into the future of space flight. So ASC's mission is to provide an international forum and network of orbital space flyers to promote the benefits of space science and exploration for all. of course, to inspire the next generation of space explorers, and nobody inspires the next generation like an astronaut does. And one of our major a major component of what we're doing now, and Dan touched upon this, is to try to deliver the astronaut perspective to promote better stewardship of our home planet. So we've had a very active last year and a half in advocating for enhanced space traffic management systems and growing stakeholder awareness about the potential hazards of orbital debris to our colleagues on orbit and to critical infrastructure on orbit. So our International Committee on Space Traffic Management, chaired by astronaut Mark Brown, is working with a coalition of U.S. and international organizations to establish a space traffic management code of conduct and best practices for mitigating the growth and hazards of orbital debris. As most of you probably are aware, the ISS occasionally has to perform an avoidance maneuver. And if they were unable to do that, or we didn't have good catalogs of the debris that's in orbit, bad things can happen. Let's put it that way. Our international committee as well, our International Committee on Near-Earth Objects, chaired by astronaut Tom Jones, is working with the United Nations and other near-Earth object-oriented organizations and companies to monitor the potentially hazardous asteroids and develop the technical, political, and legal frameworks for mitigating the effect of potential Earth impactors. So up until 10 years ago, nobody was thinking much about near-Earth asteroids, and now we have, in a way, led the way to grow awareness about the hazards of those objects. In the STEM space, Dan has already talked a lot about what we do, and we're very, very lucky to have him as a volunteer. He, as a former education manager with the ISS National Lab in Cases, he brings a lot of passion and expertise in the STEM field. So we're really happy to have him working on the many different STEM projects that we're working on right now. One of the things that he didn't mention, and I think this is an important component, Alec touched a little bit upon it, but we have a program called Astro School. And what that does is it teaches teachers to teach STEM. We fund 50 teachers a year. They take a 6-month online program. They get professional credits for it. And we have found that teaching the teachers has a multiplier effect across all of the students that we're trying to reach, not just in the near term, but in the long term as well. So, Alec has done a great job with his programs in terms of teaching the teachers. Francisco as well. So I applaud all of you for your work in promoting STEM and creating the opportunities for those young folks to get a leg up in the spaceflight world. That's all I have. Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you very much, Andy. And ASC has affiliations across the globe, and each one of those has educational outreach as well. So we have a multiplier effect, and Andy helps to direct all of that. Well, with that, I'd like to turn it back to Carl, who has some challenges and questions for all of you.
Yeah, thank you, Bonnie. I've listened carefully to the wisdom of our panelists, and I'm impressed with the range of interests that are displayed by each of you. But let me get back to where we're trying to go. Why do we have these sessions on space education and outreach? And really, it's to maintain space activity as a priority for humankind. I think that's probably the overarching thing. And we want to inspire and develop the workforce. And we have a number of challenges which have been showing up over the years that we're making some inroads into, but we still have further to go. Do we have the right tools and techniques in place for achieving this? Do we have the right messages and the curricula? And are we delivering effectively? As I've listened to the panelists, I think we have touched on all of these things in local and sometimes more than local ways, but we don't yet have the overall integrating effect that I think we're going to need to be able to make the kind of progress that we ultimately will need to do. And so based on that and based on the things we've discussed in the past, I thought I would start this part of the session off almost with some action auctions, where we try and build up out of our core here some action teams that deal with some of the areas where we don't think, where we think some more integration and so on is needed. And I have 4 of these, or 5 of them. First is information centers, and I'll deal with each of these in more detail as we go through. The second one is message development and delivery. The third is workforce development. The fourth is funding sources. And then the fifth, of course, is our own role as an education and outreach panel. So as I go through these, what I would really like to have is people on this panel, and maybe people who are listening into this session, to volunteer themselves to be part of an action team that tries to move these forward by the time we come to next year. The first one is information centers. And we have discussed in the past the establishment of web-based portals on space activity, which can be populated and accessed internationally with space information, education information, stories, and how-to information. And we need to establish the links for the centers of space information. And finally, of course, we need to establish who's going to be taking a role in making this happen. So with that as our first sort of focal point, are there any comments from panelists in terms of either volunteering to do something in this area, to be part of an action group that makes this happen, and to be part of a support group that makes it happen? So over to you on information centers.
You know, Carl, if I can just say something that Mike said resonated with me, and that is being a guardrail and not an oracle. And I think when you condense, if you try to integrate too far with centers of information, you end up being an oracle rather than a guardrail. And there is some value in having a wild kingdom, if you will, of space and STEM in the space and STEM ecosystem, because I think it allows people to exercise their creativity outside of a box that may have been provided for them, and they may not recognize that there are things and opportunities outside of that box.
I think that's a good comment. And I think the intent here is not so much to sort of say, these are the rules. It's really to almost be the Wikipedia of space. This is where you get information that will help you move out by yourself. So you don't have to reinvent everything from scratch, but you have some sources of information that you can tap into, you can use or ignore as you wish. So I take your point. I think it's a good point. But I don't think the intent is to now put constraints on future ideas in place. It's to provide a basis to allow the flourishing of new ideas.
Carl, if I might throw out a discussion point we had in at least 2 of our breakouts in the past, was to develop a landing site, if you will, a website, a landing site, not unlike what NASA and ESA has, where we could put the links to all these programs, which doesn't exist right now. And that action was actually taken up by Dr. John Charles. And fortunately and regrettably, as we all know, is a wonderful advocate for education. He passed away earlier. So there is a thought that maybe we at A&M could do that, is to develop a small committee to pull together all this information and develop a landing site for these programs, which would link back to programs. And if they're international, you would know that. If they're national, you would know that. If they're local, they would know that. For example, we have a question on chat about programs in Illinois, and that was answered. This was how my audience members become engaged with STEM outreach activities mentioned in the panel today. Being from the St. Louis area, I'm especially interested in supporting STEM outreach activities in rural Missouri and Illinois. And Mike very generously offered that he's working with 4-H extension groups to get CubeSat emulators into high schools in Illinois, and gave them his email address. So that would be a perfect example of helping to consolidate that onto a landing site. I'm certainly willing to work with anyone who wants to help me pull that information together. A team is a little faster than me individually.
And Bonnie, I'll certainly help you with that. I just put another link in the chat of a landing site we've developed here at Illinois, our Illinois Space Tech Academy. And there are a number of resources there for students, for interested parties, other places to go look for space information. And that could be a starting point for this kind of discussion.
Okay, and just to read that, it's in our internal chat, but for the audience, it's isgc.aerospace.illinois.edu, Illinois X-space-technology-talks.
Yeah, I'd like to echo some of the comments that you made there. Excuse me. I really liked Andy's metaphor of the oracle versus the guardrail, and I'd like to sort of think of another type of metaphor, which is a library versus a playground. Mm-hmm. That it's very easy. I won't say easy. Everything is hard, but on a scale, to have a library where we have links to things that are happening. But I think that what we really need to create is an environment in which young people can just explore and create and come up with their own ideas. Now, the Windows on Earth might be an example of that, certainly NASA's Crew Earth Observation Program has an exceptional library of the full archive of images, but how do you make it a way that people can engage with them, can use these videos in their own creative ways? Somebody yesterday was saying they want to connect the videos with whale songs and have flying over the Caribbean and the sounds of the humpback whales. Well, what a creative idea. And I think the way that the projects that we all represent have succeeded is because we're engaging young people in doing things, not giving them things, but doing things. So the more we can, I think of what we're creating as playgrounds instead of libraries, perhaps the more helpful it might be.
I would be interested in working on this, and there's really some good comments have been made about, how you define the boundaries here, so it's not limiting. And in terms of getting engaged, I found it's often surprising what's going on in local communities if you start searching for it, where there are a lot of concerned people who live there working in STEM fields. But the question about how do you connect with rural areas is a good one. And I suspect in many areas there are dedicated people there, but somehow this would be good if this, information center encompassed all of that in some ways. So there's awareness after it is built, and how do you reach out to some of these underserved areas? I think that would be a great goal for the use of a resource like this.
Well, that's very productive. We've had 5 people all interested in contributing to this. And what I suggest is that Bonnie take the lead in this one and work with all of you to see how we can make some real progress, recognizing what the purpose of this is, which is not to constrain, but to release. Okay, let's go to the next point, which is messages on space, which is message development and delivery. Over the past years, we've had a lot of discussion about the new ways of communicating, which of course includes social media, and maybe different ways of telling stories. Mark Craig last year gave a very interesting exposition as to how we need to involve people who are not at all involved with space to help us in developing how messages might be delivered in the future. Now, this is something that I don't know how much expertise there is within the group. I know each of you have been dealing with message development and delivery, but is there an overarching methodology which we haven't tapped into yet, which would expand our individual capacities for doing this? So I'd like to have some comments on that from the panelists. The question of message development and delivery, have we got what we need, or do we need to go further? Okay, it sounds as if we need to get Mark Craig, if he's available, to flesh this one out a little bit. It hasn't got a strong response. Let's move on then to work.
So Carl, one maybe response to that I would see is that message delivery and development is intimately tied to the development of the information centers. I think you've got to decide what your message is, and then design your delivery method, your info centers, to support the message that you're trying to get across.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you just did these in that order, but I think that if you reverse the order and focus more first on information delivery, what are we trying to say? That will lend itself towards helping us decide the best way to do it.
Okay. So that brings me back to the question, is there anybody who'd like to be working on this question with us on the panel, the message development and delivery?
Well, let me see if this fits in with what you're thinking of, Carl. One of the things I wanted to do going forward with my human spaceflight course is to talk with folks like Bonnie and Linda and Steve about how they're delivering that material. They're the experts. And I thought perhaps, and others who would be interested in maybe attending a 1 or 2 day workshop to address how to best deliver the material that they've lived through in a short semester time frame. And, are there different approaches, different means of doing it? Everybody has a different experience. I wanted to assess the interest of our panel here and maybe doing that next spring.
That sounds an interesting contribution. Andrew, can I get you and Michael to work this a little bit further? I know, Andy, in your role, you've done a huge amount of this type of activity anyway, so you'd be a natural in terms of providing us some insights into message delivery. Would you be prepared to help take something like this on?
I can certainly try. Mike, by the way, I'm 9 hours ahead of you, depending on where you are, so we just have to coordinate. But and Dan always has fantastic ideas about how to deliver messages to our constituencies, if you will. So I can certainly happy to help. And Steve, I see, also is volunteering.
Okay, great.
And I certainly be willing to help. I throw out to you the question about metrics and impact. because that always goes along with messaging.
Well, that's great. We've from nothing we're filled with good intentions. That's good. The next one we had was workforce development. And I think this is something just about every one of our panelists spoke about. And of course, it has a great range of activity, like strengthening the links between teachers, students, and the space community in government and industry using their facilities, including hands-on experience, provide opportunities for experienced space practitioners to teach at universities. Michael, this is something you were bringing up last year strongly. Target education initiatives for K-12 and universities, support curriculum development. And today we've had a lot of suggestions that we do more focusing on bringing women into this whole area. I think workforce development has so many facets to it at the university level, at the school level, at the professional level. It would be good if we could, in some way, focus on where are the gaps that we really need to be addressing. Any comments from the panelists? Not for the moment. Okay. Well, what I'll do is I'll come back with a couple of emails and maybe flesh it out a little bit for panelists' consideration and see if they believe they might have a role in moving this forward.
Carl, I just might want to throw this out because Andy brought it up, and I think that Mike did as well. But International Space School has Scottish Space School has also addressed this, and that is teaching the teachers. One of the things we're finding in rural areas is that there are not enough teachers to teach the math, the physics, and the chemistry that are prerequisites for those trying to go into the workforce. So we need to talk about workforce development, not just from the student side, but from the teacher side. Mm-hmm. Is that a universal problem? I don't know. How do we address it if we know it's a problem either locally or nationally?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Bonnie.
Yeah, and Bonnie, we're certainly seeing that here in Illinois as well. In the rural communities, the teachers don't have time in a lot of cases because of the other curriculum responsibilities they have. And so we have to be very careful about what we feed them in an organized fashion so that they can actually, as you said, meet the metrics at the end to show that we're actually delivering a product that's useful.
Well, some states have a shortage of high school physics teachers. Some high schools are going without physics teachers. Students are taking it in summer school so they qualify for engineering. And if you are a physics teacher, you can get a premium salary now in some Northwest states. So I think it's a challenge that needs to be identified. And how do we develop the workforce of students who want to go into education and teach physics and math?
That's actually been something we've had grants before to address here in Missouri through the university. And a while back, there was a multi-year program to teach physics first, which was kind of interesting because where do you break into, even before the specifics of engineering, you've got the biology, chemistry, physics, which has historically been the flow. And there was a real move to teach physics first because it's all circular. And where do you break into understanding all these areas of, science? And the problem is that a lot of biology trained teachers teach physics because they just don't get enough physics teachers. And they held a bunch of summer programs over the years. It was a 2 to 3 year for each cohort, teaching them how to teach physics and have some metrics on the results and follow up. And it was a major, NSF grant to do it. It takes things kind of on that scale to make a real difference. But you really hit the nail on the head by saying we don't have enough people because it's such a challenging field to go into, and how do you get people to want to teach that in, say, by ninth grade students and get them interested in physics, that know that the teacher knows the physics or the math. And so I realize I'm not saying anything solution oriented here really, but I am, just wanted to comment on a program that actually did seem to make a measurable difference, which was this one big project here to teach the teachers.
Well, I know teachers struggle to find resources and information. My sister just retired from teaching, and I was her source through K through 12 on space. Whereas again, this gets back to a landing site of resources. And the National Academy of Engineers actually created a similar type of landing site called Link Engineering, but it's general engineering and it's designed for teachers. So that's something we can flesh out when we meet.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we might want to look at, we've had the challenges in the USA, which are certainly repeated elsewhere in the world as well. And this is an area where taking up a linkage with UNESCO might be quite useful, particularly for going into developing nations where they have an even more chronic problem than do we. In addressing this question, they might be able to give us some hints and clues as well. All right, it's a huge topic, and let's try and make some progress.
If I could just say one more thing, we really focus on science, technology, and math, which the panel has admitted and recognized that some students, it just doesn't resonate with them.
Right.
That has been the traditional path to space, but it is no longer the only path to space. There are new domains developing in business that students might be interested in pursuing. So I think presenting the whole range of opportunities, not just to science, technology, and math, but the other paths to creation of new platforms, of new companies that are going to support the evolution of human spaceflight, I think are equally valuable, because we might reach a larger set of students that might get turned off by I just don't like math.
Yeah, that's a really good comment. During my period with the International Space University in the summer program, we would often try and invite speakers to come for this 8 or 9 week program. And when they went back into the education system, they often had a huge influence, because they now became the center of discussions about space, and they stimulated a lot of things. I know this to be true in Canada, and it may be true elsewhere, but giving teachers that sort of opportunity for engaging in and then becoming, if you like, the prophet in the education system can be very helpful.
Can I just say, from my experience, as Andy said earlier on, that we did quite a lot of work with teachers, particularly the teachers who came to Houston, and then when people from Houston came to Scotland, a lot of work was done with teachers, and it was very effective, and we're still seeing benefits of that to this day. However, I think that all of that and what you suggest is linked to the next point, which is actually how do we fund things like this?
Yeah. So I think we have the makings of moving forward on this one. We have some ideas of where the focal points should be. And I think that does lead us naturally to the next step. And nobody was really able to speak on the panel to funding sources, because none of us are the source of funds. We're maybe the recipients of funds. And the funding sources are really public and private sector. How can we stimulate that? And how can we make the public and private sector recognize that this is a really important thing to be funding? It's a challenge. I don't know quite how to do it. But for instance, just one example, university grants for research. increasing those would be a good one. And funding for a lot of these initiatives dealing with the lower levels of education and outreach. These are all important, but I think it's an incredibly difficult problem to persuade the organizations that have sufficient funding available to do this sort of thing to actually part with it. I'm certainly prepared to work on that one, but I don't think within the panel we have the solution. Maybe we just have the advocates for increasing it. Any further comments on this?
Well, Carl, I know one thing we can do, and I know Bonnie's aware of this as well. There are organizations like the Barry Houston Economic Partnership and IAAA that sends groups of people to Capitol Hill each year. And it's really important to make sure that students go with those groups and are put in front of those groups to talk to the staffers, to tell them about the benefits they're getting from the tax dollars being spent on those projects. And so I always look for those opportunities and try to sponsor a couple of students to get up there to be able to talk about that. If we don't communicate those benefits, the folks that are providing those funds just don't know what they're helping out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Mike. Again, going back to the ISU, many of the students were funded, and we made a point after they'd been to the ISU sessions that they went back and talked, either at a forum like the International Astronautical Congresses or back to the funders themselves. I think that's a really important point. And I've always found that an enthusiastic young person who's benefited from the program is much better at marketing the need for more than a whole lot of gray or no heads like ourselves.
Could I just say one last thing on that? And so my experience in the Norway project is that the funding that we get to run this on behalf of the young women in Norway isn't coming directly to a space project. Mm-hmm. The funding already exists. It's part of a national program in Norway that is promoted by a business-led organization to get more girls to study engineering. The idea, because we were partners with the organization in Norway, that the input of space can actually enhance that already funded project, is why the space part of the project is currently working.
Oh, that's a good input, Alex. Thank you.
That actually has some application, I think, to a lot of federal programs. There's quite a bit of STEM funding in the U.S., I expect in other countries. If you can find out who's being funded and help them promote a program. We find that with grants. For example, if a federal grant says that you have to allocate 1% of your grant to K through 12 outreach, rather than reinvent the wheel, you find a good successful program and you partner with them to help, might be delivering your research, for example.
Okay, good. We'll move forward on that one, and I'll tap into various people to try and move the yardsticks. Brings us to the last one, the role of ISMS Education and Outreach Panel. We've been getting together, many of us for several years now, and we do it once a year. And I think what we would like to do is meet online regularly, and maybe these action teams will make that happen anyway, just to update ourselves on what's happening and stimulate new ideas. And also, I think we as a committee might like to reach like-minded partners in the IF, UNESCO, IAA, ISU, lots of other organizations that try, and some of the organizations the panelists represent. I think we should try and build up relationships with these organizations I'm certainly happy to take on some of this role and to make this happen. And if other people would like to join, that would be great. And I think there's enough richness within the panel to really make some interesting connections with other groups. Any comments before we open up the chat line and move on from there?
I think it would be helpful if the panel acted as a sort of self-help group to enable people to both reach out and to get assistance on developments that they have in the works and are planning.
Okay, that's a good idea. Sharing the information and getting, getting help through that. All right, I think that's good, Chris. Okay, Bonnie, to you.
Yeah, that's an excellent idea, Chris. I think we need to find a mechanism so that the audience out there or anyone else can contact us and that we can draw those connections. So it's interesting, rather than questions, we actually have volunteers in chat. Here we have a volunteer from TRISH, which is the Translational Research Institute for Space Health. And they're volunteering, and we invite anyone who'd like to participate to do that. TRISH is actually a great mechanism for us to work, because they are also interested in workforce development. There's a comment about Meta Life, and I've taken that information down. It's Second Life, NASA's virtual space flight in Second Life, using called Reusing This Playground for Learning and Outreach, and I have some websites for that. And we have a note from Mark Craig, and he spent his career forging policy and strategy to make human spaceflight sustainable. Messaging is key, as you mentioned. So is building humanity's psychological highway into space, where the moon is key as a preload to Mars. So definitely we'll be working with you, Craig, and perhaps you'd like to participate in our panel next year and have some thoughts about that messaging. So I don't have any other chat items. I'm not sure the best method for the audience to express their interest after we close, but definitely go through the Baker Institute, and Carl and I will help to referee all of that, make sure that we get back to you. Carl, would you like me to just do a few close comments, or you first?
I'll just comment. The Q&As have a number of things on them too. Did you look at those? There are 8 items.
I'm on the...
There's a sort of bubble that says Q&A.
Yeah, that's the one that I have open.
Oh, okay. There's another one called chat.
Yeah, and that's our internal one.
Oh, okay. Okay, then we're good. We're good. Please wrap up.
Okay.
For us.
Yeah, you can wrap up too. Well, first of all, thank you to everyone who participated today. Some of you have been here before. It's wonderful that we continue to meet. Hopefully next year it'll be face-to-face, and we can also then deliberate into our breakout sessions. Carl and I have been discussing over the last few days, how do we move from our recommendations page that we present every year into an implementation page? And that's what this session was about. We've been identifying the root causes now for several years. We make progress, but we're not certain we're all knit together to help move it to the next level. Some of those levels include NASA leadership in education. We know those people up there. We've had NASA leadership actually present now to the International Space Medicine Summit. So education would be one of those elements that we can include. I know that Dr. Charles was passionate about helping to develop that landing site where we can put the information we talk about every year on it for a much broader audience. So I look forward to working with those of you volunteered do that, and actually had a new volunteer, Dr. Olga Vanova from the University of Houston Space Architecture Program, who's offered to help us do that. So whether it's K through 12 or it's university, it's postdoc, which is something we haven't talked about as well. That's part of that workforce development, all the way into developing the next generation of doctors who both MD and PhD, who will then go back to the universities to teach and do research. Those are all parts of it. The K through 12 is still very complicated. Mike and Linda and I understand some of the challenges working in the rural arenas, and so does Alex. I mean, when the International Space School was started, it was to reach students throughout Scotland. And for those of you that are new, when did we start that? 1999, Alex?
Started it. I met you, Bonnie, for the first time in Glasgow in the year January 2000.
Okay, and he found the funding and the vision to bring in astronauts from NASA to reach every school or every district in Scotland, so we could touch everyone. And then working with his funders and the University of Strathclyde to bring students and teachers to the United States to visit the NASA centers. He's extended that into his program with his international network. Chris Barber's working international. All of you have an international component primarily. And what Dr. Borokova is doing in Russia is she's been recognized as pretty extraordinary in terms of keeping that very important space medicine pipeline active as well. Francesco and all of the students he brings to the U.S. and being able to find host families for them. Steve, taking your leadership and experiences in space and taking them into the department. You may have been only there 10 years, but you've done a remarkable job. I know you've been department head. Now you're back into research. So Dan, what you're doing with your innovative programs is just really outstanding. And I probably missed somebody, but my apologies. I think we've got a wealth of talent here. We're going to use you to continue into implementing some of the recommendations we've been developing over quite a few years, and we'll be getting back to you. So Carl, that's kind of my small mini wrap up. I'm going to turn it back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Bonnie. That was a great wrap up. And I would like to thank you for your excellent work in both preparing and co-chairing. And I'd particularly like to thank each of our panelists who add so much wealth to the knowledge base in outreach and education, and who give their time freely and give their ideas. It's wonderful to be working with you, and we look forward to continuing to do that throughout the year. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl and Bonnie.
Thank you, Carl and Bonnie. Great panel. And we'll remind everyone that you can refer people to this panel. It'll be online through Baker Institute, or if you want to send somebody to it to review it later on, it'll be available. And
okay.
10:30, we'll be starting with the Steve Robinson and the spaceflight and automation.